This video is sponsored by Squarespace. By the end of this video, you're going to know what your character stats are if life were an RPG. So you're going to have all of your baseline stats, which are these 8, by the way. I'm going to put them on screen, as well as your primary stats out of these 8. Any synergies from that, your dump stat. I've done a much longer video breaking down the full RPG system, but you absolutely do not need to watch that video first to watch this video. Watch this video first because it's probably more fun, honestly, and like simpler, and then watch the other one if you're interested. Basically, in this video, we're going to turn you into an RPG character. So while you watch this, have something with you which you can use to like take notes, so like your phone or like paper or something. Before I start the video, I'm going to say a disclaimer is I'm going to go through like a bunch of questions and like we're going to go through the stats, right? And you're going to have to rank yourself. Try when watching the video to refrain from the urge to just rank yourself as like mid for all of the stats, right? The reason being, even though like statistically bell curve average, most people are going to be kind of like average on most traits, that is going to make this kind of like a boring video because at the end you're just going to get the middle score for everything, which basically means cool, you're basically an NPC. What the am I supposed to do with that, right? So try to rank each stat like in absolute terms, like based on like what you think you are, but also like rank the stats relative to your own build. So for example, if we're talking about like charisma, then rank charisma as like relative to like, oh, am I like more charismatic than I am like intelligent, you know what I mean? So like try and like have a little bit of variation. Obviously that makes it kind of like a more subjective, like less objective video, but also this video is about RPG characters, so I don't know what you're expecting about objectivity. Now that that's out of the way, let's get started. Have something with you that you can use to take notes. So for the health stat, health is basically definitionally, but also in terms of like the RPG world, health is basically like the underlying foundational stat that determines your character's baseline bodily operating capacity. So what I mean by this is the health stat is going to affect all of the other stats in the sense that if you have a very depleted health stat, that's probably going to create penalties for your other 7 stats that like the other stats probably don't have the same level of influence for. So the health stat, it affects how long your character is able to stay functional before your performance starts deteriorating. So when ranking your health stat here, don't just think about your character's fitness or how medically healthy your character is. Obviously, those things are important and they contribute to the health stat. But the question that you should be asking yourself here is how costly is it for your character to keep participating in gameplay due to your health stat right now? So you can pick out of 3 categories for where to place your health stat. So you can rank your stat as either high, mid, or low. So I'm going to give you some like descriptive ideas of like what the high and the low stat kind of feel like so that you can kind of like gauge where you are on that scale, right? So starting with high health, if your character has a relatively high health stat, then it probably means that your character is able to recover quite quickly even after strenuous quests or like a strenuous day. So for example, if your character had like a really fucking terrible, exhausting day, they were doing like a lot of shit, maybe like lots of like quest lines were running together, maybe like, you know, your career quest line, your relationship quest line, they're all like kind of merging together. It was a very overwhelming day for your character. After a night's reset, if you go to sleep and you wake up the next day, is your character still functional even after all of the work that it had to do the previous day? If the build stat of your character the next day is still like pretty functional, like your intelligence and your discipline capacity hasn't really gone down, it hasn't really taken a hit, then that probably means that you have pretty high health. Contrast that to if your character has a pretty low health stat, then that probably means that even if there weren't catastrophic events happening throughout the day, maybe it was like a moderately busy day, that can still trigger like a penalty to your intelligence, your discipline, maybe you get like a movement speed penalty, like a general effectiveness drop over the entire build, then that can probably indicate that you have a lower health stat. Another thing to think about when you're thinking about your health stat is the types of things that contribute to the health stat, right? So like you can evaluate each of these separately and like see generally where you fit, right? So some things that influence the health stat are energy resource, recovery speed, which you mentioned, your character's stress tolerance, your character's physical capability, and like injury resilience or like injury recovery time. So within this, fitness is a component of that, but it's not going to be like the entire health stat, right? And speaking of which, I have to discuss the fact that the health stat and the appearance stat kind of have a relationship in the sense that the appearance stat can sometimes lead to a misleading health health stats. So what do I mean by this? I mean that like if your character tends to have like a pretty high appearance stat, sometimes that can correlate to a pretty high health stat, but it doesn't necessarily correlate in the sense if you have a high appearance stat, right? Your character could have like a great physique, maybe they have like visible abs. They just generally look like they're very capable and they're very fit, but that character can still have a really low health stat if they're constantly tired or they like recover badly or they're like frequently injured or like if their injury recovery time is slow. Therefore, high appearance stat does not automatically mean high health stat. Couple more questions that you can use to like determine where you are in this. Just like kind of like briefly kind of like think about them and like just rank yourself on a rough scale, right? So the first question is, how often does tiredness affect your intended gameplay? So what I mean by this is if your health stat is like affecting your intended gameplay in the sense that maybe your character's canceling plans or they're like skipping activities or avoiding going out and they basically have to structure their whole day around conserving energy because the build is like performing like because the health stat is low, then that's probably an indicator that you have a low health stat. Another thing is like physical demand tolerance. So ordinary examples would be your character walking around all day or like carrying things or like exercise. Important to note here is that you don't need like athlete level performance to have a high health stat. Remember what I said earlier in the video, the stats should be ranked relative to like the other stats in your build, right? So your character doesn't have to be like an Olympic athlete for them to have like a high health stat, right? Basically, it's like assess the cost relative to your baseline, and if you have a lower health stat, then routine physical tasks probably consume more resources or require disproportionate recovery for your character. Hi, if you like to watch these videos, then I'm gonna make a few assumptions about you, right? So first one is you're online a lot, which is kind of a given. Second is you're probably pretty young. You're either still in school or like you just graduated and you just started your career. And if that's you, you probably don't know where to start with showcasing your resume, your work, your portfolio. So I'm going to give you a suggestion that I wish I had, which is that you should probably make your own website. Why make a website, Crystal? So number one, it makes you look more legit, which sounds kind of stupid, but it is actually really useful when looking for a job or clients. And also if you're just getting started, right, having your own website makes you look established before you necessarily are, which is really useful if you don't have any experience. Second reason is you control what people see when they look you up because you have a page that's designed around what you actually want people to know about you. You can format it, and the easiest way to do all of that is to use Squarespace. So why should you use Squarespace in particular, right? So really simple. It's because they make it the easiest to make a website. That's why you should use them. It's the fastest, so why wouldn't you pick them? Squarespace in particular has a ton of professionally designed templates, so you literally just pick one that you like and then you like edit the text and the images. You can use the drag and drop feature and just like move stuff around, and then after you get it up, you can get a custom domain on Squarespace as well, which means you don't have to go somewhere else to do it. And once you do that, you can also edit the SEO on your site, which makes it actually discoverable. Again, you do all of it on Squarespace. So when you're ready to get started, go to squarespace.com/crystal for a free 14-day trial. And when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/crystal to get 10% off your first website or domain using code crystal. Another thing you can consider is like sleep and energy reliability. So obviously there's always going to be like RNG, right? Like, so sometimes you're just going to get terrible sleep RNG. You're going to have like fucking terrible sleep. So don't think about those. Judge your character's normal state and ignore like one bad night's sleep or like an unusual stressful day. Just assess, generally speaking, does your character wake up reasonably restored? Is your character's like energy pretty predictable day to day? Can you roughly trust tomorrow's available energy based on today? And the final thing you can consider is quest availability for your character based on your health stats. So what this means is like, does your character's physical condition remove quests from your gameplay? In the sense that like, if your health stat is too low and you have to like decline quests or like skip social plans, avoid demanding activity because you're trying to like conserve energy, then that would kind of be an indication that health is like low enough that's actually like narrowing your actual quest selection. And if that's happening to you, you probably have a low health stat. So think about all of that and also look at the cheat sheet that I'm going to put on screen right now and then determine is your health stat in high, mid, or low. Basically, the intelligence stat determines how expensive or like resource heavy it is for your character to process complicated tasks or like complicated instructions. So the cost and resource can come from a variety of different resources. So one resource would be time. If it takes your character longer to understand something or learn a task, or repetition. It might take your character more repeated attempts at that skill in order for them to pick it up. Explanation. So maybe your character requires longer or more more repeated exposure and explanation to the instruction that lets them learn the task, or even potentially in the resource of currency if your character has to pay like another player or like a teacher or tutor or mentor to like kind of help expedite their learning process. So when trying to rank your character's intelligence on like high, mid, low, I'm gonna give you a couple examples of like high intelligence stat characters and like lower intelligence stats, and then just like kind of like see where you kind of fall and like rank yourself there, right? So starting with high intelligence effects and stats. If your character generally has a higher intelligence stat, then that probably just means unfamiliar systems, it makes it cheaper for them to learn, right? It costs less resources, as I mentioned before, fewer repetitions, your character picks up on like patterns faster. Contrasting that to lower intelligence stat, if your character has a lower intelligence stat, that same skill that they're trying to achieve is probably still fully achievable. So the distinction here is not whether or not some skills are like unlockable for certain characters. The distinction is more about like resource cost, right? Also, really important note here, a degree does not necessarily mean a high intelligence stat, because a degree in this RPG world that I just made up, a degree is actually equipment and it's a credential, but it's not actually a stat in itself. It's not actually indicative of like a high intelligence stat. So obviously as a credential, it unlocks some quest lines for your character that might not have otherwise been unlocked if you didn't have that degree, right? So for example, it might give you access to certain job quest lines, or there might be like a reputational bonus added because you have this piece of equipment. And obviously a degree, it's most likely like a reward that your character won after completing a really long academic quest chain. So like a degree is correlative to a high intelligence stat, but it can't be used as like automatic stat assignment because my character has a degree, therefore my character has a high intelligence stat. And also because your character can have a high intelligence stat without having a degree. I'm gonna give you like a really niche, hyper specific example here, right? So like let's say your character knows like a lot about one specific domain. So like let's say your character knows a ton of flags, like you show them any fucking flag in the world and they'll just fucking recognize the flag. So they might know like an enormous amount on that one specific topic, but that doesn't necessarily mean that that character possesses generally high intelligence as a stat, right? Because that just means they heavily leveled a specific knowledge tree here, that knowledge tree being knowing about flags, and they accumulated lots of flag related XP in that very narrow domain, which is not the same thing as having a high intelligence stat. So another thing to help you rank your intelligence stat, I'm gonna give you like a couple questions, like a couple like general concepts that you can like consider when thinking about where you rank on this, right? So the first thing here is learning speed relative to other players and like your peers, right? So compare your character with the players around you in their environment. So for example, it's school or work, or maybe at a new hobby, or playing a complicated game, or like learning a technical skill, right? So when your character is in this environment relative to other players, does basic logic click for your character faster than it would for those other players? If you feel like your character gets the basic logic faster than your peers, then most likely they probably have a high intelligence stat. Second thing to consider is transfer or like generalization of knowledge and of intelligence. So this is probably a really high indicator of a higher intelligence stat. So what this means is basically, can your character generalize and like transfer skills and knowledge that they learned in the first version of that skill tree and then apply it to an unfamiliar version with altered details? So can your character easily infer what to do by applying previous similar concepts that they had learned before in a new context? And can they adapt when there are surface details changes to that scenario? Third thing to think about is pattern recognition. So does your character easily notice connections, contradictions, repeated behaviors, like causal relationships between different skills and different events? So if they can do that and like link patterns across lots of like unrelated domains, then that's probably indicative of a higher intelligence stat. Fourth thing to think about is your character's capacity for complexity and like your character's tolerance towards complexity. So is your character a character that can deal with many different variables interacting simultaneously, right? Or can they handle lots of different moving parts within a quest line or several quest lines at once? Can they keep multiple pieces in mind? Can they like understand dependencies, understand interactions? So think about all of that, and also look at the cheat sheet on screen right now to determine if your character is in high, mid, or low intelligence. By the way, if you're interested in getting a PDF version of the information in this video, it's basically like a cheat sheet of all the information in this. You can find that in my Ko-fi page up there, or the link is also in the description down below. Moving on to the charisma stat. So charisma on a first glance is basically the difficulty modifier for social checks, right? So what this means is if your character has like a high charisma stat, it affects how quickly unfamiliar players warm up to your character. And it also increases the persuasion success of your character. It increases the rapport speed, your character's ability to turn one contact with a certain player into more contacts with other players. So like networking effect. And having a high charisma stat usually means that more social quests become available to your player through other players. So on the other hand, right, having a low charisma stat doesn't mean that social quests aren't open to your character. Like obviously that's not true, but it probably costs way more resources to unlock those same social quests. So for example, it might take up more energy, more conversational effort, more attempts before rapport forms, or it might just lead to like a higher failure rate on persuasion and social checks. Also, one thing to note here, having a high charisma stat is not the same as having an extroverted character, right? So talking a lot doesn't necessarily mean that your character has a high charisma stat. In the same way, having a more reserved or quiet character, they can still have a high charisma stat, because in determining how high your stat is, you should be thinking about like external evidence. So do other players enjoy talking to them when they do talk to them? Or do other players kind of trust your character quickly? Does your character get invited to secondary locations? Do they get included into parties or in groups, right? Are they generally a desirable party member? Party here like in the RPG sense, but also in like the literal sense. So when trying to determine your character's charisma stat, you can like consider the following things, right? So the first thing is the speed of rapport that your character has with new players, right? So specifically, you should be assessing situations when your character is interacting with players that they're unfamiliar with, or like players that they have like little to no existing reputation or like existing relationship with, right? So for example, if your character is in like a new domain, right? For example, they're in like a new workplace or like a new class, like a party or like a friend of a friend, a networking event, you know, like is your character in those unfamiliar environments? Are they able to have conversations with unfamiliar players quickly, in the sense that it becomes rapport builds very quickly between them? Like does it conversation become comfortable quickly? Are they joking really naturally? And do other players start to include your character without much effort? If that sounds like your character, then your character probably has a higher charisma stat. Second thing to think about is interaction chaining or like map expansion. So what this means is, does one social interaction with another player usually create more interactions or like more opportunities and more quest lines for your character, right? So is map expansion really easy in this kind of like social way? So like after meeting one player, does that lead to an invitation or like an introduction to another player? Or maybe that player remembers your player, or like that player contacts you afterward, they includes you in another event. So one effect of having a strong charisma stat is that one encounter can often unlock several more quests or like several more nodes, and the social map expands in a really easy, like non-resource heavy organic way. Third thing to think about is persuasion checks. So is your character able to very easily make a case for themselves, get other players or like party members on board with them? Is your character able to like easily negotiate or ask for something without creating awkwardness with other characters or having penalties applied to them when they, you know, when they're trying to like negotiate with other players? Are they able to like explain ideas so that other party members and other players actually care about them? Fourth thing to consider is resource costs. So specifically the resource cost of initiating in like a social manner, right? So when evaluating this, you should separate this from anxiety, which is actually a debuff that your character can have, but it's different from the underlying charisma stat. So being anxious or being nervous can coexist with having a high charisma stat, and you should focus on what happens once the interaction with your character actually begins. So when your character encounters another player, is your character able to like approach them and generate viable conversation? And can your character sustain it, or does the other player need to carry most of the conversation? And then also think about this in terms of like resource costs. So does initiation cost a lot of cognitive effort or like conversational effort and repeated failed attempts at initiation before something becomes successful? And the final thing that you consider is, do other players become resources for your character? That sounds really bad and sounds really problematic, don't cancel me, but it is probably like the strongest practical check of whether your character has a high charisma stat is if they do have a high charisma stat, do other players become resources in the sense that other players help your character, they recommend your character, they include your character, you know, they volunteer useful information that can help your character in their objectives or in their quest lines. Do other characters offer opportunities for new quests to your character? High charisma often creates this kind of like social leverage and like social advantage for your character without your character having to like explicitly use forceful tactics on other players. So basically, high charisma stat means other players are actively trying to make gameplay easier for you because the relationship exists and the rapport exists. So consider all of that, look at the cheat sheet on screen and try and like roughly determine where your character falls in high, mid, or low charisma. So the discipline stat basically controls your character's ability to continue investing in a skill or in a quest line after the immediate reward disappears for them. So if your character has a higher discipline stat, that usually means that your character can start a quest and even after the novelty of that new quest is faded and like the progress has slowed and there's like no tangible like new checkpoints that your character is unlocking and there's like no other players kind of like watching over your character is still grinding at that quest several months later, maybe several years later, and that probably means that your character has a high discipline stat. Contrast that with a low discipline stat. It might still mean that they're excellent at starting quest lines, but once the novelty wears off, your character probably loses continuity once the sense of urgency or accountability disappears, and your character in their backlog probably has more abandoned objectives. So when considering your character's discipline stat, you should remember that discipline is not the same as how your character performs in an emergency. So what I mean by this is your character being able to respond really well to like external pressure does not automatically mean that your character has a high discipline stat. In fact, it can even be an inverse correlation. So for example, let's say your character had an assignment for like an academic quest line that they ignored for like several months, right? And then the deadline is tomorrow, and so your character completes the entire assignment in like one caffeine fueled emergency like holy shit sprint, right? And they finish it and they hand it in, right? So even though the task got completed on time, that is not indicative of high or even like mid discipline stat, because this does demonstrate that your character has like capacity under pressure, right? They have like good urgency response. Possibly it indicates like high stamina because you did it all at once, but it doesn't really demonstrate like everyday consistency or like internal enforcement, right? Or like internal drive and like internal motivation to grind at the same objective every day. So couple concepts and like questions for you to consider when ranking your character's discipline, right? So the first one is there evidence in your character's backlog of maintained long-term quests? So common general quest lines are training quest lines, academic studying quest lines, creative quest lines, financial quest lines, you know, like saving money, skill quest lines, like learning new skills, general routines that your character has to do just on a regular functional day-to-day basis, business and career quest lines. So the key condition here is that quest line needs to be a long fucking quest chain. So the reward needs to have come after months or years of grinding at that quest line without tangible reward or like tangible checkpoints in the middle. So if your character has a good track record of that or like repeated long-term maintenance, then that's probably evidence of a higher discipline stat. Second thing to think about is dependence on external quest pressure. So I kind of talked about this earlier with the assignment thing. So basically, if your character needs like a kick in the ass in order to get something done, so like external enforcement, right? So like a deadline or like a boss breathing down your neck or like a teacher or like a client appointment booking, you know, like if your character already paid money for it, or like social accountability, if your character needs external enforcement to kind of get them to perform a task on time, then that's probably indicative of lower discipline. So you should assess, does action happen only once outside pressure appears, or does your character kind of create their own pressure and their own routine? Third one, already touched on this, basically it's your character's behavior once the progress becomes boring, right? So like once the novelty wears off or the quest is like it's getting old, the key transition point here being, you know, delayed reward, repetitive tasks. Does your character continue on that quest line, or do they abandon the log here, right? That's probably the clearest differentiator. And then moving on from that is the number of abandoned quests in your character's log. So you might have evidence of this through equipment. So for example, like a half-purchased course, or books abandoned after 20 pages, or just like in general, like if your character failed to learn a language, or they started a gym quest line and then they abandoned it, or like half-started creative projects. You know, all characters will have some, obviously, but if your inventory is dominated by like majorly abandoned quest lines as opposed to completed ones, then that's probably indicative of lower discipline. Obviously, if your character realizes that a quest is bad once they like get in the middle and they like rationally quit that bad quest, that's not the same as like having low discipline. But if your character repeatedly quits once effort becomes boring, or like effort becomes kind of the deciding factor, then that's probably stronger evidence for a low discipline stat. So think about all of those concepts, look at the cheat sheet, and then determine where your character's intelligence stat falls. Okay, moving on to the next stat. This one is gonna be a little bit uncomfortable potentially, but it's the appearance stat. So the appearance stat is basically probably best described as like a pre-interaction modifier for your character. So the modifier is applied before any charisma checks that your character performs, any intelligence that your character demonstrates, you know, before other characters get to know the personality of your character, or before there's any like reputational checks, or like their reputation develops organically between other players, right? So the appearance stat acts as a modifier which affects encounters starting conditions. So if your character has a relatively higher appearance stat, then that can also create bonuses for your characters. So for example, an attraction bonus, a halo effect bonus, a friendlier first impression encounters, increased initial attention from certain players, romantic dialogue might start appearing earlier, or like romantic quest lines might become available for your character, or more easily available. And since we're talking about the appearance stat, I do have to address character creation RNG when talking about the appearance stats. So obviously all of the stats are kind of influenced by RNG, but it's probably most obvious in the appearance stat, which is that your starting character creation RNG when you started the game gives you a baseline stat for your appearance, which obviously your character currently, it could have been modified by fitness or grooming, you know, style, skincare, presentation, makeup, hair, right? So when ranking your character's appearance stat, you should be ranking them by their current stat. So obviously character creation RNG affects this, but rank your character currently, which could have been modified by all of those things that I just listed out. So not just by their baseline stat, but what the stat kind of looks like right now. So to help you kind of like find out where your character places on this stat, you can consider the following guidelines and like questions to like help you kind of figure it out, right? So the first one is pre-stat encounter modifier. So it's basically what I said before, which is before other players know anything substantive about your character, assess how those players act around you, right? So like before charisma checks, intelligence checks, you know, achievement, personality, does it seem like encounters usually already start slightly in your character's favor? You know, do other players notice you? Does your character receive unsolicited compliments? And do they get repeated favorable treatment before your other stats can kind of operate, or like prove evidence of like higher competency, or like evidence that other players should help you? Your appearance stat might be helping you with that. Another thing to consider is access to social or romantic quest lines. So this is different from you considering whether or not your character personally looks good. So it's not about like whether or not you think your character, you like the look of your character, but when considering this, focus on like external gameplay outcomes, right? So do other players initiate romantic encounters with your player? Does romantic interest appear without much prior interaction for your character? If your character is using a matchmaking tool, for example, like a dating app, do they have success with that matchmaking tool? Like before personality can be assessed, are first impression checks more favorable for your character? In contrast to that, having a lower appearance stat can increase initial friction before your other stats can compensate for that initial modifier. Third thing to think about is consistency across contexts, or like across different domains for your character, right? So assess the repeated outcomes that your player kind of has across different players, different environments, different encounters. So if you realize that you kind of get all of those attraction-based bonuses, or like you have easier access to social or romantic quest lines and interactions across those different contexts, then that's probably stronger indication that appearance modifier appears repeatedly, and that broader pattern is probably like more indicative than like one-off isolated events with like certain players. So consider all of that, look at the cheat sheet on screen, and then roughly determine whether your character is in high, mid, or low. Okay, moving on to the wisdom stat. So wisdom is basically the determining factor for your character's quest selection as well as their strategic judgment. So basically, the wisdom stat determines whether or not your character chooses good quests in the first place. Wisdom is very different from the intelligence stat because the intelligence stat is more about like learning patterns or like learning skills or like the speed and frequency at which your character picks up skills, right? But the wisdom stat determines whether or not your character is like selecting the right quests or like selecting the right skills or objectives to kind of level up. So for example, a character with a high intelligence stat but a low wisdom stat could spend years grinding on like an academic or a career quest line that they get really good at because they have really high intelligence stat, but they realize years into that quest line they don't actually want that quest line. Another function of the wisdom stat is that it's more likely to prevent your character from doing repeat quests. So what that means is if your character has a higher wisdom stat, then they're more easily able to recognize when a new quest is actually like an old quest, like an old underlying quest that's like just different on like a surface level, right? So for example, if your character is on a romantic quest line and they repeatedly date the same types of players with the same unwanted flaw, right? But they're just like, they're different players, but they have the same underlying bad outcome that your character doesn't want. Or maybe your character keeps taking on the same kind of like bad commitment, or maybe the same category of mistake in their career questline, their academic questline keeps resurfacing, right? If your character has a higher wisdom stat, then they're probably updating after each failed outcome of previous questlines and their previous run, and they take that moving forward to select better quests in the future. So when considering your character's wisdom, consider the following things, right, to help you determine where you are. First one, mentioned it already, repeating the same category of mistake or repeating the same quest line over and over. I'm not going to talk about it again. The second one is the strategic decisions that your character makes once your character is already inside the quest. So what this means is, let's say your character selects a new quest, they invest lots of resources in that quest, maybe time, maybe money. A substantial part of the quest chain has completed. If at that point, new information appears to your character, maybe progress slows in that quest chain, maybe the reward changes, or the end goal of that quest looks less attractive, a character with a lower wisdom stat can now fail here in like two opposite directions. So the first mode of failure that a character with a mid to lower wisdom stat can fall into is sunk cost fallacy. So what that means is your character, because they invested so many resources into this quest chain, even though now the objective or the reward at the end of that quest chain has changed, your character continues on because they already spent all the resources here. They invested so much time and resource in the quest. The past like resources invested now determines like the future decision or like the future actions and future outcome for your character, because your character is emotionally unwilling to accept that they just wasted those resources and like those resources are gone, so now I have to like continue on this quest even though your character might not necessarily want to anymore. But the second one is the opposite, which is really annoying, but like the opposite end of that, which is premature abandonment of a quest, right? So if a quest becomes difficult, there's like a temporary slowdown or like there's no more like tangible like dopamine hit reward for your character, then your character immediately assumes that they're going down or this quest is no longer right for them or is wrong, and they abandon the quest prematurely, right? And the issue here is that your character might think that they're making a strategically sound long-term decision, but they haven't considered the actual end goal or the wider picture of the quest itself, and they're making decisions based on very limited knowledge or because this current part of the quest feels bad, therefore they abandon everything. So the defining feature here is a character with higher wisdom is able to kind of understand why continuing or abandoning that specific quest line or that specific skill or objective fits the strategy for what that character wants in their gameplay. And then obviously another thing to consider is before you start the quest selection. Like having a higher wisdom stat usually means that before accepting a quest, you're able to evaluate, do I want the reward at the end of this quest? Do I want the goal at the end of this quest? Is this a skill tree that I want to develop? Do I want to spend actual gameplay resources, time to obtain that objective? So think about all of that, look at the cheat sheet on screen, and then determine if your character falls in high, mid, or low wisdom. Next, we're going to talk about the courage stat. So the courage stat basically determines your character's willingness to accept quests where failure has higher resource stakes or emotional stakes, basically like higher stakes, right? So lots of quest lines and lots of opportunities don't require your character to actually possess a really stacked build in order for them to accept the quest. Usually the gate to accepting a quest is the willingness of your character to risk rejection, embarrassment, failure, looking stupid, or discovering that your character is less capable than they hope to be, right? So here, courage is basically a quest unlocking stat. It doesn't really determine how well your character performs once they've accepted the quest, but it affects whether or not they actually accept the quest in the first place. And obviously, a character with a high courage stat doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have fear. So your character can still possess fear, but your character could feel the fear and then take the quest anyway. That sounds cheesy as feel the fear and do it anyway, but that is the determination here. So when determining your character's courage stat, you should think about the following general guidelines. So a couple of guidelines, couple of questions to help you kind of like figure out where your character is on this stat, right? So the first one is acting before success or the objective is known. So this is probably the easiest metric to use, and it's basically, does your character need a high level of certainty before acting or accepting a questline, right? Or is your character willing to move or commit to an action before the outcome is necessarily resolved? So an example might be starting a project or applying to a new job, like going to a new environment, initiating an encounter with an unknown player. A character with a higher courage stat usually means that they can take action before certainty arrives as to what the end goal or the end outcome of that quest is. Another thing to consider is that the courage stat affects a character's embarrassment sensitivity. So what that means is, would your character do something if there were no other players to witness them potentially failing? Or would your character initiate a romantic questline with a different player if they knew that that rejection would stay private, right? No one would know about it. Would your character pursue like an entrepreneurial questline if they knew that no other players were there to like judge them? If your character has a really high embarrassment sensitivity in the sense that they wouldn't take action or like take certain actions if other players were there to potentially witness their failure, then that probably means that they have a low courage stat, and also that courage is a major limiting factor in your character's performance. Another thing to consider is look at the backlog of unaccepted quests that your character wanted but never accepted, right? So look at the quest log for things that weren't accepted but your character clearly wants or clearly like the idea of the gameplay of, right? So for example, a job application or like initiating a romantic quest line, a project quest line, a project that they planned in their head and they never did, having difficult conversations with like other players or like other party members in order to keep the peace with party members. Another thing to think about is response after failure. So one benefit of a character with a high courage stat is that includes re-entry into the same quest line or same encounter after having a bad outcome. So let's take a romantic quest line as an example, right? So if your character initiated a romantic dialogue with one player and they got rejected, would your character then initiate romantic dialogue with a different player? Or does that one rejection mean that your character never initiates a romantic questline ever again? So think about all of that, look at the cheat sheet, and determine whether your character is in the high, mid, or lower band for courage. And then moving on to creativity as a stat. So creativity basically determines your character's ability to generate options in the game that were not already obviously presented to your character. So let's say that the game presents you with 3 different options for gameplay, right? So a character with lower or mid creativity might select out of those 3 the best available option, right? But a player with higher creativity might look at all of those, decide that they don't really like the gameplay of any of those that much, and they invent a 4th option for themselves. So basically, a character with a higher creativity stat can generate more original ideas, and they can make unexpected connections or alternative solutions if none of the ones that are presented to them seem that optimal to them. So it unlocks the ability for your character to generate possibilities rather than selecting pre-existing possibilities presented to them. One thing to think about is that creativity is not the same as like your character possessing artistic or like technical skill, right? So your character possessing, let's say, like drawing ability or like artistic ability, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have a high creativity stat, right? So like drawing, let's use drawing as an example, right? Drawing is actually just a highly leveled technical tree that your character probably spent a lot of time grinding. So that's a very knowledge and niche specific skill, but creativity as a high stat is more general, right? It can be applied generally across many different domains, right? So there's more evidence of a creativity stat when a character is able to change framework or like create new approaches to gameplay or quest lines. If a character is able to like invent something that's not handed to them, that's indicative of higher creativity. And it can show up in all aspects of domains, so not just like artistic domain. It can show up in like a science quest line, an engineering, business, writing quest line, or like everyday problem solving, right? So when determining your character's creativity, you should think about the following things. The first one being idea generation when there's nothing else presented to you. So basically, this is about your character doesn't choose the best option, but they're able to generate options themselves, which, for preferable gameplay, preferable outcomes. The second one is connections that your character can make between skills across different domains. Right? So if your character has the tendency to see one idea in a different area or like use one skill that they developed in a different domain, they can combine different concepts and skills and techniques, especially for domains that other players might treat as unrelated or where other players think that there are no skills that can be applied. If your character is able to apply unrelated skills, then that's probably a strong creativity signal. Another sign of a character with a high creativity stat is they have external evidence of their character's originality, right? So maybe in their interactions with other players think their gameplay or their method of doing a certain task or like leveling up a certain skill tree is kind of original or unusual, or if other players tell your player that they wouldn't have thought of that, then that probably indicates a higher level of creativity in your player. And finally, you should think about how your character responds when the obvious route or path fails, right? So if the standard solution is blocked or if the gameplay is not optimal, a lower creativity player might keep repeating the same attempts or like use slightly different variants of the same strategy when approaching that objective, versus a higher creativity character, they might just search or invent a different route or a different method of gameplay which allows them to resolve that issue. So in this way, if your party has a character with very high creativity, they could be very valuable in these certain situations or these certain events and encounters, because under constraints or block paths, a higher creativity character is able to generate strategy and routes that other players are unable to see. So think about all of that, look at the cheat sheet on screen, determine where your character falls in high, mid, or low creativity. Cool, so now we ran through all 8 stats. I'm fucking losing my voice at this point, but hopefully you were taking notes while you were doing that. So now you're gonna look at your whole sheet, right? So you should at this point have at least 16 words, which is basically all of the stats, and then mid or like high or low next to each stat, right? So that's cool. Hopefully they're not all mid, otherwise you're probably just an NPC. And also that would be a really fucking boring video, but now we're gonna look at your stats and we're gonna interpret them. Starting with your character's strengths, aka their primary stats. So out of those 8 stats, I want you to now choose the 2 strongest stats out of those 8, right? So like obviously if you feel like, oh, but I'm a pretty average player, then choose the 2 strongest stats relative to the other stats on your sheet, right? I would say max pick 3, but honestly, just pick 2. Those 2 are going to be your primary stats, and they're basically the attributes that your character's build most naturally relies on in everyday gameplay. And also it means when the game presents a difficult situation to your character, this is probably the kind of check that your character usually wants available in order to kind of resolve that issue. So look at your primary stats. Your primary stats probably shape your character's preferred problem solving route. Their quest selection is probably heavily influenced by their primary stats. The primary stats probably determine your character's repeated advantages in encounters or in quests, and they also determine what your character build tends to just lean on first. We're going to talk briefly about each primary stat. So if intelligence is your primary stat, then your character's preferred solution is understanding the problem, right? Understanding the mechanics, figuring out the rules, reducing uncertainty. If charisma is your character's primary stat, then they probably resolve issues through other players. They have high persuasion, high rapport, high networking. Your character gains allies easily. They're able to obtain information from other players. If discipline is your character's primary stat, then your character has persistence persistence as their advantage. So they're the player that keeps investing even after all other players have stopped, right? So your character wins through accumulation, through consistency, through their ability to grind way past when everyone else has stopped, right? So they're well suited for long progression chains. If creativity is one of your character's primary stats, then their advantage is option generation, right? They find routes that other characters don't immediately see. They're able to reinvent and like reframe quest lines and problems. They're able to invent alternative solutions and find gameplay that suits them. If your character's courage is the primary stat, then they're more willing to enter uncertainty or like accept uncertain quest lines and risky quest lines before any other player, right? So they most likely gain access to certain quest lines and certain gameplay that other players don't even attempt. If wisdom is your character's primary quest line, then that means that they are better at strategically selecting quests over other characters, right? So they know which quests deserve investment based on their personal goals and how they personally want to play the game. They're more likely to avoid misaligned rewards and avoid trapped quests. And they're also able to change and update their gameplay and their approach based on evidence. If health is your character's primary stat, then their advantage is they just have more capacity than other characters, which means they're more easily able to sustain demanding quest lines. They're able to tolerate a higher workload, and they also have a lower recovery time compared to other characters. And the good thing about health as a primary stat is it also means your character's less likely to lose all of the other 7 stats through physical depletion or through resource depletion. And then finally, if your character has appearance as a primary stat, then your character probably starts with more favorable starting conditions compared to all other players. There's a very high first impression modifier before all your other stats are checked, which could lead to an advantage for your player. Your character probably enjoys attraction bonuses, halo bonuses, initial social advantage bonuses, and relationship and social quest lines are probably easier for your character. Cool, and now that you know your strongest stats, we're going to talk about synergies. So synergies, if you don't know, is basically one strong stat is good, but 2 strong stats together can sometimes combine something that's more valuable than like each individual stat independently, right? So some common synergies that your character might have include intelligence plus discipline. So if your intelligence and discipline stat are both really high, then that combination means that your character is able to learn difficult skill trees or difficult material relatively quickly, and they're also able to grind and persist long enough to actually exploit that advantage or get to that outcome, right? So your character is probably well suited towards expertise or mastery or long quest chains. Another synergy is intelligence plus creativity. So combined, this means that your character is able to manipulate and recombine quest lines, gameplay, find unusual solutions, because to be honest, both of them are both about like kind of like adapting and like thinking outside the box. So combined, it means that your character is able to really find routes that suit them and they can manipulate existing systems to their advantage. Another synergy is creativity plus courage, because it means that your character has lots of good ideas and they are able to find alternative routes, and the high courage stat lets them convert that possibility into actual gameplay. It allows them to actually unlock opportunities for themselves. Charisma and courage is a good synergy because combined, this character probably initiates quests or like initiates encounters with unknown players very frequently, right? And then during those interactions, they have very efficient ones. They have very effective ones, like this character creates very high social opportunity for themselves organically. There's strong conversion rate here. Appearance and charisma is also a synergy. So combined, it leads to very strong initial impression modifiers, right? So the appearance stat allows for a strong first impression bonus, and then the charisma continues on, right? It allows the player to kind of network very effectively. Health and discipline is another synergy. This character is probably really good at maintaining very demanding routines or like very demanding forms of gameplay, right? So this character is probably well suited to physically demanding or very strenuous quest lines, because the character has both the capacity and also like the mental grind to like keep working at a quest line that's not really reaping rewards but is also depleting a lot of their resources. Another synergy, which is really good and probably the one that I value the most, it's wisdom plus discipline. So I think this is good because discipline as a stat, it's kind of a double-edged sword if you think about it, because discipline can amplify bad strategy. So if you have wisdom as one of your primary stats, then it means that you know that the time and investment that you're placing into certain quest lines lines is the right one for your character. And it avoids your character spending years on the wrong quest line or moving in the wrong direction. And the final synergy that I want to discuss is wisdom and courage. So combined, this leads to good quest selection, and the courage allows your character to actually accept that quest once you've done a wisdom check and determined that the quest line is right for you. Cool, now we're gonna move on to dump stat, which is basically the opposite of your primary stat. This is your weakest stat out of the 8, right? So look at your least developed stat. It's probably the stat that's like the lowest out of the low. It doesn't have to be like catastrophically low, but even really maxed out characters, balanced characters have relatively weak attributes, right? So the dump stat is basically which stat of yours is the least developed compared with the rest of them. And obviously when discussing the dump stat, it's most likely that your character didn't consciously min-max unless you're like actually like a looks maxer or something, or like your character's probably not consciously min-maxing. That's probably not their strategic gameplay, right? But the dump stat probably emerged indirectly anyway, in the sense that your character probably used their natural strengths more, their primary stats more, and so those successful stats continued unlocking more quests, right? And so your character would continue choosing gameplay that rewards those stats, so it's like a reinforcement loop, right? But what that basically means is one of those stats is probably gonna get left behind. That's your dump stat. And after determining your dump stat, this might be something that your character could work on as like a, like strategically, it could be something that your character could improve, because it probably reveals the weakest entry point of your character, right? It's where your character could potentially be taken advantage of. Or it might be something that's affecting your gameplay actively. And that is your base character sheet. My voice is starting to get sore. What do you do now, Crystal? Now I have my character sheet. And also, what does my character mean? Like the actual combination. I want to know with the dump stat. You kind of glazed over the dump stats. That's true. I admit. I have to fucking piss. That's why I did that. But if you're interested, don't worry, because the next video in this series is gonna go through what your character means. Because if you watch this channel regularly, then you know that I made a career out of being a super judgmental bitch. So don't worry. That's gonna be the next in this series. So subscribe for that. It's gonna come out. And also, if you want more in-depth into like the general concept of like life as an RPG, then check out the first video I made, which is here on, and also I made a playlist here of all of the RPG videos. If you're watching this in the future, then maybe all of this is resolved and everything is released. Thank you.